Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. Colin Todd, a continuation of the evidence that we began yesterday. So would you ask Mr. Todd to come in, please? Good morning, Mr. Todd. Yes, do sit down, please.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. Ma'am. Sir.
Now, before I invite Mr. Millett to continue putting questions to you, can I just say this? Reviewing yesterday's evidence, which I think it's fair to say we all found very interesting and very useful, I was rather struck by the length of some of your answers.
Yes, sir.
I do understand that you have a lot of knowledge that you wish to impart to us.
Yes, sir.
As I say, we did find it very interesting and useful, but I think I must ask you to keep your answers a little shorter if you can. Otherwise, we're going to overrun the time that we've allowed.
I'll do my very best, sir. Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind, thank you. And I'm going to repeat also what I said to both of you yesterday. Please take care not to overspeak each other, because if you do, it makes life very difficult for the transcriber.
Yes, sir, certainly.
Well, with that introduction, when you're ready, Mr. Millett. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Members of the panel, good morning. Mr. Todd, good morning to you.
Good morning, sir.
Can we then revisit where we were yesterday, which is
Yes,
the
sir.
topic of flat entrance doors? And I want to ask you about inspections. Can we start, please, with the LGA guide, HOM 3045964, page 45, section 35. And this is part of the LGA guide, which sits in part D, for which I think you did the initial drafting.
Mr. Millett, I'm sorry to interrupt you quite so early, but my transcript isn't running. Can I just check?
You're right.
I think none of the three of us have a transcript. Is yours running?
No, it isn't. I've just noticed.
I wonder whether we should.
I'll just
solve
refresh
that.
it to see if it runs now. Lord. No, I've still got a blank.
Well, I think we ought to solve that before we
Yes.
embark on serious questioning. So I think all I can suggest, I'm sorry about this, Mr. Todd.
Not at all.
We don't have too many of these problems, but when we do, we really just have to sort them out before we get started.
Yes, sir.
So I'm going to ask you to go back to your retiring room, if you wouldn't mind, and we'll rise for a minute to have this sorted out.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Mr.
Well,
Miller, I think the only thing to do is to rise for a short time.
I'm afraid so, yes. I think that must be right.
Thank you. So perhaps ask the usher to come and tell us when you're...
Certainly, yes, sir.
Would you ask Mr. Todd to come back in, please? Yes, do sit down, Mr. Todd. Welcome back, everyone. I'm sorry to say that the problem we have with the real-time transcript has not been resolved. However, counsel here in the hearing room does have access to a real-time transcript, and the panel has decided that we can manage without one. I'm aware that those who are following the proceedings from remote locations who would normally have access to this transcript will not have it for the time being. It may reappear in due course, but we can't guarantee that. We've decided, therefore, rather than waste any more time, that we should continue without the benefit of the real-time transcript. But because we are well aware that those who wish to follow Mr. Todd's evidence and maybe to suggest further questions for him will wish to have seen the transcript before they finally decide whether they do wish any further questions to be put to him. We will make arrangements to ensure that they have a chance to view that transcript before they decide finally whether any further questions should be suggested for Mr. Todd. When and how we do that will depend a little bit on how we get on for the rest of today. The only point to remind people of, perhaps, is that you can follow the proceedings on the live stream and therefore understand Mr. Todd's evidence as it is given. So under those circumstances, we're going to continue now with Mr. Todd's evidence, albeit in the absence of the live transcript. Yes,
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Todd, can I take you then, please, to Section 5 of the LGA Guide, HOM 000-45964, page 45, which sits in Part D. You can see under Type 1 at the top of the page, common parts only, non-destructive.
Yes.
Fire risk assessment. And if you look at the second paragraph there, in the second sentence it says, but as well as considering the arrangements for means of escape and so forth, the fire risk assessment includes examination of at least a sample of flat entrance doors. It also considers, so far as reasonably practicable, the separating construction between the flats and the common parts without any opening up of construction. However, in this type of fire risk assessment, entry to flats beyond the area of the flat entrance door is not involved. Now, your reference, or the reference there to at least a sample of flat entrance doors is what I want to examine with you. Would you agree that such an inspection would require the assessor to gain access to the flat in order to examine the presence and condition of the self-closing device and cold smoke seals where needed?
Yes, and other things, but yes.
Yes. So in practice, what kind of percentage of flat entrance doors was considered suitable and sufficient within the trade?
Right. So that figure has evolved, sir, and it is now a kind of unwritten understanding that the figure would be about 10%, with a minimum of 2. That tends to be it wasn't necessarily then, but that's what's evolved. So give you some idea of custom and practice.
Right. Taking 2012 then as the benchmark point, what was the standard suitable and sufficient percentage at that time?
Yes, there wouldn't have been, as I said, sir, it's evolved. There wouldn't have been one. An important thing was, trying to keep my answer short, would be to look at different typologies of door. That's important. And particularly to look out for situations in which leaseholders had changed their flat entrance doors. It's a very common occurrence that when people buy their flat or buy the 99-year lease or whatever, they change their flat entrance doors. It's like a sort of badge. And so you need to look out for that because often they don't put in a fire-resisting door.
Right. When you wrote, or when this guide was produced, and the expression at least a sample of flat entrance doors was inserted there, what did you have in mind would represent an acceptable sample? at that point?
Yeah, we wouldn't have had a specific figure in mind. It would have been a matter of reasonableness on the part of the fire risk assessor.
Right. Can we go to Mr. Stokes's evidence, please, at day 136, page 95? And go to line 15 in that, please. And you could see there the question, my having shown him what I've just shown you in the LGA guide, what was your understanding of what was required when the guidance here speaks of examining a sample of flat entrance doors, by which I mean what kind of percentage proportion of doors would you expect to examine to satisfy yourself that you had checked a sample? Answer, the short answer would be if there's different types, one of each type, if they were all the same and you knew they were all the same throughout the whole building, as long as you could sample a few of those, but if there was more than one type or style, we could turn the page, try and get as many samples or look at every one of those as possible. Is the approach that Mr. Stokes described there adequate?
That would probably reflect custom and practice at the time,
right.
Sir, yes.
Right. Now, except where an entrance door is identified as deficient in some way, Mr. Stokes did not appear to record in his FRAs the specific doors that he checked, nor the percentage of doors inspected. He told the inquiry during his oral evidence that he only inspected a handful, his words, or 5% or so.
Yes.
Is 5% or was 5% during the period between 2012 and 2016 a sufficient or an insufficient sample properly to perform his role?
If they were all the same, it's probably on the slim side, but not unduly. The only thing is, I mean, that would tell you about the fire resistance of the doors if they were all the same. What it wouldn't tell you was the extent to which self-closers had been removed. But then, unless you did 100%, you would never know how many self-closers were removed.
Was it good practice for a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to record which doors had been inspected as part of the sample, if not all of them, when carrying out a fire risk assessment?
It would certainly, I mean, we would do that always, but not everybody would again.
And where they wouldn't, would that fall short of acceptable standards?
I've never considered that it would fall short of acceptable. I've always just thought it was best practice to have a record, if only for your own liability.
And would that good practice remain good practice even where no defects were identified with a particular door?
Oh yes, absolutely, yes.
Now, can we go to your main report, please, page 80, CTA 6011, page 80, paragraph 838. Foot of the page, you say, with further regard to the doors that had not been replaced, it is clear from the FRA that Mr. Stokes did examine a sample of these doors to confirm that they were 44mm thick, as would be the case in a traditional fire-resisting door, that they fitted properly in their frames, and that any gaps between the door and the frame were acceptable in size. He also noted that the letterbox was within the lower part of the door. The significance of this is that it is less likely to be affected by fire than if it were in the top half of the door, where positive pressure would tend to force hot gases through the letterbox.
Yes, sir.
Now, having reviewed all of Mr. Stokes's fire risk assessments for Grenfell Tower, do you agree that the paragraph in the FRAs to which you're referring in this paragraph is subject to minor alterations repeated across all four of Mr. Stokes's FRAs for Grenfell Tower between 2012 and 2016?
As I recall, that's the case, and if you tell me that's the case, then I would accept that. I do recall a great similarities at the very least.
Yes. Well, I don't think I need to take you through all the documents.
No, sir.
During your review of the FRAs and significant findings and action plans, is it right that you found no documentation to show that Mr. Stokes inspected individual doors which were not found to have any deficiencies which required them to be included in the significant findings and action plan?
Sorry, could you repeat that question, sir?
Yes. Did during your review of Mr. Stokes's FRAs,
yes,
is it right that you found no documents to show that Mr. Stokes inspected individual doors which weren't found to be deficient in any way?
No, there was no record of, I recall. The only one I recall, it might have been 112, I can't remember, but it was one that it was being replaced at the time in question, and he saw that a leaseholder was replacing it, and therefore he expressed concern as to whether the door was fire resisting or
Yeah.
not.
You are right, and we'll come to that in a moment. In fact, let me show you three where Mr. Stokes did identify doors as presenting a risk or hazard within his significant findings and action plans. Well, I can cite them to you because you'll be familiar with them, but if we need to look at them, Mr. Todd, we can. First, the 2012 FRA action plan, and I'll just give the reference, CST 403083, page 3, item 12B, where he identified holes in flat entrance doors to flats 166 and 202. The June 2016 action plan, item 12G, CST 403069, page 4, where he identified that the flat entrance door to flat 24 was damaged and missing a letterbox. And the same action plan, same page, page 4, item 12H, where he identified that the flat entrance door to flat 112 was being replaced and asked for confirmation that the door was a certified FD30 door and that a self-closing device should be fitted to the door. Now, I've summarised for you there, we can see them if you like, those three entries. In the light of that, do you agree that Mr. Stokes only, in fact, identified 4 flat entrance doors within Grenfell Tower that he'd actually inspected?
Yes, and that were deficient, yes.
And those were all as a result of a visual inspection from the outside of the flat, not an inspection of the inner leaf of the door.
Is that what he actually said, sir?
Well, it's from your. I'm really asking you from your experience of inspections, whether that is a conclusion that the inquiry should draw.
I need to see the wording, and I don't want to take up your time unnecessarily. But,
Right.
but I agree with the point you made earlier that in order to check a door properly, you'd always need to have it opened. That's definitely the case.
Yeah. Maybe try it a different way. Would you agree that, with the exception of the open door at flat 112, which you've identified, you've never seen any evidence yourself in the inquiry's material where it shows that Mr. Stokes ever identified any problems with flat entrance doors which would be apparent from any internal inspection?
No, I don't think I saw any.
No. Now, would you accept that would you accept that there's no evidence which suggests that Mr. Stokes examined a sample, in the sense you understand it, of flat entrance doors both inside and out?
No, I may have made that assumption, sir, because you would have to open it. Whether I actually saw anything that said he had the doors open, I can't remember. That may have been an assumption on my part, sir.
Yes, and no evidence that he ever embarked on any kind of sampling exercise of any kind, as opposed to reacting to what he could see?
My impression was that he checked a sample because he referred to that 5%, didn't he? So my understanding, but that could be wrong, is that he was sampling doors, and I assume by that he had the doors opened.
Right, but slightly at cross purposes.
Sorry.
What I'm really getting at is evidence from within his fire risk assessments, the record of his fire risk assessments about his sampling.
No, he doesn't go into any detail in that respect, no.
No. So when you say in your report that there's evidence that Mr. Stokes examined a sample of flat entrance doors, what were you referring to?
That he made reference to the flat entrance doors. He talked about the leaseholder doors that had not been replaced, and he gave a bit of a description about them as you see there in 838, and so that's what I was talking about.
Would it be normal practice for a fire risk assessor to carry out a sample as opposed to simply reacting to what he saw, and then record the sampling exercise and its results in his fire risk assessment?
Yes, you normally put down, I checked doors XXX and found whatever.
XXX being a sample.
The flat numbers.
Yes. And would not doing that fall short of acceptable standards?
Not everybody would do it, as I say, we do. I think the important thing is that he checked a sample. The specific record would be more to protect your own liability as to what you'd done.
Yes, but by not recording the sampling exercise that you had done in your fire risk assessment, would you, as a fire risk assessor, fall short of acceptable standards? That's the question.
Yes, I understand the question. I can honestly say I've never regarded it as such. Where I've looked at fire risk assessments of others for various reasons, I'm not sure if I've never said this risk assessment isn't suitable and sufficient because there's no records of the doors that were checked. I might have commented on it as good practice.
Right. Can I then turn to the topic of maintenance of flat entrance doors and self-closing devices specifically?
Yes.
Can we go to your main report, please, at page 72, paragraph 7.37 in the middle of the screen? And you say, as in the case of any FRA, the matters to be considered by a fire risk assessor can be broadly grouped into three distinct categories, namely fire prevention, measures to prevent the occurrence of fire within the common parts, fire protection, measures to maintain the safety of the common parts in the event of a fire within the common parts, and within any flat, and management of fire safety.
Yes.
And then if we look at the bottom of page 72, you can see paragraph 740, which goes over to page 73, and you say there, with regard to fire protection, matters that should be considered include, and then there's a bullet point list on page 73, starting with means of escape. And if you look down at the sixth bullet down, you can see you've listed flat entrance doors.
Yes, sir.
There. And your list of management of fire safety a little bit lower down the same page, fifth bullet point down, refers to arrangements for testing and servicing of fire protection measures and equipment, doesn't it?
That's correct, sir.
Yes.
Well, it's not on the screen, but I'm sure you're right.
No, you're right, and that's my fault. Can we have that on the screen just so that everyone can see it?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, it is. Now, looking at the inspection and maintenance of flat entrance doors and of self-closing devices in particular, is the task of the fire risk assessor to monitor and assess, first, the physical state of repair of the doors and door sets, and second, the adequacy of the system of maintenance and inspection implemented by the responsible person?
Yes to both, sir.
Yes to both. And then having done that, is it right that he should then use those findings to determine the level of risk?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Would you agree that the process of conducting the fire risk assessment is not itself a component of the maintenance and inspection system? By which I mean, you can't outsource the conduct of the inspection to the fire risk assessor himself.
Yes.
Yes, you agree with me?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Now, the evidence of Janice Ray was that the TMO did not implement a 6-monthly system of inspection of flat entrance doors as recommended by the LGA guide. In your opinion, Mr. Todd, was the failure to implement the recommended programme of inspections of flat entrance doors a matter that you would expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to have identified during the course of his fire risk assessments?
Yes, the fire risk assessor should look at that system.
Given that Mr. Stokes did not identify that as a failure of the TMO in any of his fire risk assessments, do you consider that his omission fell below the standards expected of a reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
Yes, I think he should have asked about the maintenance arrangements.
Yes. But you say yes at the start of the question. Are you accepting the proposition, which is that failure fell short of the standards expected of a reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
Yes, I think I probably would.
Thank you. Now, let's turn then to Mr. Stokes's actual knowledge of conditions relating to flat entrance doors. We looked, I think, yesterday at clause 20 of PAS 79, and the question about where work recommended in the original plan that hasn't been completed needs to be identified. I don't think I need to show you PAS 79 again.
No, that's fine,
I'm sure
sir.
You're very familiar with it. Can I just show you some examples, or tell you about some examples? We know that Mr. Stokes, from his evidence, was aware of certain information pertaining to the missing self-closing devices. First, in July 2015, flat 45, and December 2015, the concern being raised that residents of Grenfell Tower had told him that one of the caretakers had disconnected a number of self-closing devices. Now, against that fact background, it's right to think that Mr. Stokes did not include that information in the next fire risk assessment, which was April 2016, nor confirm that the issues had been rectified in the interim. Now, given all of that background, my question is, would you have expected Mr. Stokes, on the basis of what he then knew by April 2016 about self-closing devices, to have performed checks concerning those doors previously identified as deficient?
Not if he thought that they were acting on the findings of his fire risk assessment, because these doors are just a sample, and so they're not. It's not an end in itself to have identified those and then go back and check those. In fact, it might be more helpful to sample further doors,
Yeah.
so that he has a better picture.
Yes, but would you expect the reasonably competent fire risk assessor, having been told that there were defective doors, to go and check whether those defects had been remedied in order to satisfy yourself that the fire safety management system was working?
The doors that he identified the previous time, or the doors that had been brought to his attention?
The doors that had been brought to
his attention by the TMO. That would be a reasonable thing to do.
It would be a reasonable thing to do. Would it be an unreasonable thing not to do it? Or would it fall below the standards of the trade?
I think it would depend on whether he thought that they actually were active in resolving these problems, and in which case he might well choose to do a different sample.
And given the volume of FRA actions which had not been completed by the time of the next FRA, and given his knowledge about that, would you have expected him to check, by way of a check against these particular doors, that they had been remedied, in order to verify or satisfy himself that the fire safety management system operated by the TMO was working?
I think it could have been done by discussion, as what steps have you taken since last time to make sure that doors that you were aware of have been resolved. If you were content with that, then you'd be better probably looking at a further sample of doors to keep rotating, as it were. So it would depend on what he understood had been done.
I follow. If he'd been told nothing and had asked nothing about the doors which he had been told had demonstrated defects, would a reasonably competent fire risk assessor proceed on the assumption that if he had told his client that a self-closer was defective, it would be speedily fixed and he need concern himself no more with it?
That would often be a reasonable assumption if you're dealing with someone you trusted. On the other hand, it wouldn't be a bad idea to do a sample of the sample to satisfy yourself.
Yes, I see.
Did that make sense, sir?
Yes, it does. And in your opinion, given what Mr. Stokes knew about the TMO not actioning FRA actions or being slow to do so, was it unreasonable of him to proceed on that assumption, namely that if he told his client, the TMO, that self-closers were defective, he need concern himself no more with it because he could assume it would be speedily fixed?
I think I can't put myself in the mindset of Mr. Stokes and his level of understanding or trust. But to be sure, it probably would have been a good idea to double check.
Now, Mr. Stokes also told us that he didn't include information about the condition of the flat entrance door to flat 45, Grenfell Tower, in the April 2016 FRA because it was not part of the FRA, but just part of separate ad hoc advice to the TMO. That's day 138, page 126, at lines 18 to 21. Would you endorse that approach?
No, I think you can't unknow what you already know.
No, and you wouldn't endorse that approach. Could you just tell us why not?
Well, it doesn't matter how he came by the information. If he was aware of it from whatever means, that's one of the advantages of his his continuity in helping the TMO with their fire risk assessments and management.
Would you have expected Mr. Stokes to record in his April 2016 FRA his knowledge that self-closing devices had been removed or were missing in the period following his 2014 FRA, regardless of the status of those doors as at April 2016?
Yes, if he knew there was a problem with that, then it would have been appropriate to highlight it, yes.
Yes, and would you agree that by checking doors, or if not possible, then by including a reference to the problems identified in the period between the two FRAs, Mr. Stokes would have had an opportunity to both to examine and assess the effectiveness of the TMO's fire safety management system?
Yes, he did have that opportunity by virtue of the interim.
Yes, and did it fall below the standards of the trade not to have taken that opportunity, do you think?
Yes, I think probably I would agree with that if he knew there was a particular problem from whatever source and didn't follow up on it. If it was likely to continue to be a problem, then yes, probably.
Yes. Now, can I turn to a completely different topic, which is the AOV, the automatic ventilation system? Would you agree that a fire risk assessor ought to consider the automatic ventilation system in a residential high-rise building and determine its contribution or otherwise to the safety of the occupants?
You'd want to know that there was a smoke control system and that it was being maintained, certainly.
Yes. So I think, is the answer to my question
yes? Yes, you couldn't ignore it.
No. And is it right that a fire risk assessor should also ensure that there are adequate arrangements for ongoing control, testing and maintenance of that system?
Definitely.
And also that he should consider the potential for means of escape to be compromised by a ventilation system if it wasn't working?
That would be inherent in the absence of it working. Your protection of the staircase would be undermined.
Yes. And when a fire risk assessor assesses a building, how should he go about assessing the functionality and adequacy of the AOV?
By asking about its maintenance and testing.
So specifically, what records ought he to examine?
He may do it by records, or he may simply ask the question and he may accept the answer. Record keeping, it's not an ISO 9000 audit, so record keeping may well be a sampling process, and custom and practice would be to ask the duty holder what they were doing.
Should the relevant records that he does examine be noted in his fire risk assessment?
Not necessarily. No, I wouldn't necessarily keep a record of the records that were checked.
Okay. Would you expect the fire risk assessor to make reasonable inquiries of the competent person or competent assistant, in this case Janice Ray, for up-to-date information about the operation and condition of the AOV system?
Yes, sir. And just to qualify the last answer, it's good practice, even though it's not required by the fire safety order, to confirm that there are records kept in relation to various testing and maintenance.
And would it be bad practice not to do so?
Yes, as I say, it's not. There's no requirement, strangely enough, under the fire safety order to keep records, but you wouldn't actually go to the bother of telling the client that. You tell them it's good practice to keep records, and I think you'll find in the template of PAS 79 there is a section that asks for verification that records are kept.
Yes. Ought the fire risk assessor himself or herself to inspect the AOV system?
The risk assessor would probably not be competent to inspect it, to be honest.
And should they ask for the functionality to be demonstrated?
No.
No. Now, in Carl Stokes' 3 FRAs for Grenfell Tower between 2009 and 2012, September 2009, December 2010, and November 2012, he consistently wrote in the action plan that it is not known, he said, it is not known if the system is serviced and maintained. And he asked the TMO to confirm that the AOV was serviced and maintained. and on each occasion he marked that action both in red in red to indicate that it was a high priority. Now, given that Mr. Stokes had consistently raised his perpetual ignorance on this point over a 3-year period with the TMO, would you have expected him to have raised the lack of records and the implication that there's a lack of maintenance more explicitly with Janice Ray?
Yes, I think so. It's not so much the lack of records. If he was unable to confirm by discussion with Janice Ray, or however, on 3 successive occasions, if he was unable to confirm that that was being done, by that time, it was time to make, if I can put it this way, sir, make a bit more of a fuss.
Make a bit more of a fuss, yes. And in addition to that, let me ask you, would the fact that Mr. Stokes could not confirm that there were adequate arrangements in place for servicing and maintaining the AOV have affected the risk rating of the tower over that 3-year period?
I think he wouldn't know what the effect was because he couldn't confirm it. So he wouldn't necessarily assume that it wasn't being done and therefore affected the risk. It would be more that he wasn't really in a clear position to advise on that without that information, which is why it would have been appropriate for him to make a bit more of a fuss and say he needed that information.
Yes. I mean, having got an as it were, a nil return,
yes,
it is not known on 3 occasions, would the reasonably competent fire risk assessor then use that information, or rather the absence of that information, to assess the risk rating overall? Would it feed into the risk rating?
I probably wouldn't look at it that way. I would look at it that in order to complete his risk assessment and make the assessment of risk, he would need to pursue the matter further, because someone must have known that. That information can't have been that difficult to find out.
And if we go to past 79, please, page 54. Thank you. And we look at paragraph 16.3k. This is under the rubric under 16.3 at the top of your screen. In the course of the fire risk assessment, the following matters should be considered. Any shortcomings in these matters should be identified in the documented fire risk assessment and should be addressed in the action plan. And then if you cast your eye down the screen to the bottom of the screen, K, testing and maintenance of fire protection systems and equipment by a competent person, including systems and equipment installed for use by or the safety of firefighters.
Yes.
Now, given that guidance there, was it not the case that the absence of any information over 3 years, or three periods, 3 FRAs, about the maintenance of the AOV system at Grenfell Tower, a clear shortcoming in the fire safety management of the building, which he should have raised in his FRAs?
Yes, I think you're probably right, sir. I mean, he couldn't really complete it without the information, so I can only tell you what my own practice would do, and that would be, even on the first occasion, probably follow it up by telephone or email later on and say, I can't answer this question in my fire risk assessment. Can somebody please confirm one way or the other, is this being carried out or not?
Yes. And by failing to do so, did his actions fall below the standards acceptable in the trade at the time?
Yes, if he didn't have the answer on 3 different occasions and he wasn't getting anywhere, then yes, he should have been doing that. He should have been following that up.
Yes. In his fire risk assessment of the 17th of October 2014, we'll look at that. Let's go to that. It's CST 403157 at page 26. And in it you'll see at section 19 what he says about the AOV. He says, you've got the whole thing on your screen there, it's about halfway down.
I see it, sir.
There is an automatic opening smoke ventilation system. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yes. I'll just read this part to you. There's an automatic opening smoke ventilation system located on each flat stroke lift lobby area. There are two sets of vents, each of two vents on opposite walls on the flat lift lobby areas. There is a smoke detector located on each flat lift lobby area, upon which activation opens the vents on that floor level. Two vents are for inflow air, and the other two are extraction. The mechanical extraction units and the control panels for these vents are located in the roof level plant room on the wall. There's a manual override facility located in the ground floor lift lobby area for use by the fire service. Please see section 17 above, means of giving a warning in case of fire. For more information of the lift flat lobby area detectors. As part of the building's refurbishment, this smoke extraction system is being upgraded. This currently installed system was serviced by RGE Services on the 11th of October 2013. The smoke extraction system incorporates the dampers within the ductwork. There are a number of documents which Mr. Stokes saw about the condition of the smoke vent system. Let me just show you one of them. Can we go, please, to CST 401628? This is an email. If you go to page 2, this is an email from Alex Bosman on the 9th of October 2014, so about a week and a bit before his 17th of October FRA 2014. And if you go halfway down the email, you could see about 2/3 of the way down the screen, it says smoke extract. I understand a visit was carried out on 6th October 2014. This system has been confirmed as beyond repair and is scheduled for replacement shortly. No further action required. Do you agree that that information should have been included in his October 2014 fire risk assessment?
Yes, sir.
Yes. And a failure to do so, did that fall below the standards expected of a reasonably competent fire risk assessor at the time?
Yes, I think at the very least the narrative should have been there.
Yes. So is that a yes?
Yes.
Yes. And do you agree that that information ought to have been factored into his risk rating for the tower overall?
Yes, I think he should have actually, and I'm not sure whether he did or he didn't, but beyond repair, I'm not entirely clear what that means. Does it mean it's not working and can't be fixed? Or does it mean that if it breaks down in the future, you can't get parts and therefore it's not possible to maintain it properly? I don't know if he knew that, but that would need investigation.
It would need investigation, and by not investigating it, how would you characterise Mr. Stokes's approach?
Yes, he should have found out what that actually meant, unless he already knew.
And by not doing so, did he fall below the acceptable standard?
Yes, I think that's probably fair comment.
Yes.
Sir.
And a non-functioning or irreparable AOV, would that heighten the risks facing residents if a fire broke out?
Yes, it would, because it would impact on the protection of the stairway.
If we go to the action plan for this October 2014 FRA, which is at CST 403177, at page 8 we see item 19D, which is in the middle of your screen. And he says there, against a red high, under the actions to be taken, can it please be confirmed what compensatory measures, if any, are being put in place whilst the installed smoke extraction systems are being upgraded? Once the new extraction system has been installed, then a commissioning certificate for the system must be obtained, stating that the smoke extraction system is fully functional. Would you have expected a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to have advised on what mitigation measures were required rather than leaving it to the TMO to decide?
I think he's working alongside the client, so it's probably a reasonable question to ask. The problem is I'm not sure what mitigation measures you could really implement. You'd want it fixed as soon as possible, but you wouldn't go to a waking watch, I suggest. So it's very difficult to come up with mitigation measures for a non-functioning or not adequately functioning smoke control system.
Right. On the assumption that some might be available. Would you have expected Mr. Stokes to find out what compensatory measures were proposed before he submitted his FRA?
Yes, I think you'd look into that.
Yes. Yes. Now, I want to look at the testing and maintenance assessment of the AOV in this same FRA. If we go, please, to CST 403157 at page 29. This is under the part of the FRA representing his tailor-made template, part 23, testing and maintenance. And if you see 5 items down, you can see he says, the question is there a monthly testing and annual servicing and maintenance of any automatic opening vents, along with any associated equipment / devices with records kept? You see that?
Yes, sir.
And you can see that he's ticked no.
Yes.
Now, having ticked no, we've not seen any commentary in the box below it, which records that as a problem, or any action about it raised in the action plan. Do you agree that in not doing either of those things, that fell below acceptable standards?
Was this one of those where he said it couldn't be confirmed whether it was being maintained, sir?
No, I don't believe so.
And you told me about him being unable to confirm it on a number of occasions. I wondered if that was one. This is one of them.
No, I don't believe so. That's about that's 2009 to 2012.
Right.
Those are the years I put to you. This is later. This is 2014.
And there's no comment at all about that.
No, none.
And there's nothing in the action plan.
No.
Well, that can't be right. To help the chairman, possibly, sir. Try and keep...
Briefly.
Yes, absolutely. If I can explain the way this template was meant to work, sir. Every time you come across a no, the way that we would train people to use it is that a no must then give rise to a comment, and then something in the action plan. And sometimes there's double negatives even in the template to make sure that no is always the worst answer. And when you do a sort of peer review, as we would do, we wouldn't worry too much about the yeses. We'd look at all the no's and ask ourselves, does the no give rise to a comment? Does the no give rise to an action? That's how it's structured. So if that helps.
Right.
Yes, thank you.
It does. Thank you. Now, in his April 2016 FRA, he didn't explain whether the newly installed AOV, which it had been by that time, was operational or not. We can look at it if you like, but I don't think we need to go to it necessarily. But would you agree that that omission is something that, would you agree that he should have clearly spelt out in that fire risk assessment that it was operational? Should he have made a fire risk assessment of the new system, in other words?
No, I think if he was happy that a new system had been installed and commissioned, then his concentration would be more on, is it now being maintained?
Yes. The question perhaps gets a little bit ahead of itself. Mr. Stokes' evidence was that he believed that he didn't at that time have information on the new system yet, and that it hadn't been commissioned. That's day 139 at page 45, line 17 to page 46, line 1. In the light of that, what would you have expected Mr. Stokes to record if he was acting competently?
A narrative of what you have just told me, sir.
Right. And if not doing so, would that fall below the standards?
Yes, I think that smoke control's pretty important, and having narrative about that would be expected.
Can I then turn to a different topic altogether, which is cladding? And I want to ask you about Mr. Stokes' opinion on the cladding of Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
And this touches on the topic to some extent that we covered on the first day of your evidence. Can we go to your main report, please, at page 22? And you can see paragraph 317 in the middle of your screen there. And you say, moreover, in my experience, the assessment of the fire performance of the external wall construction is quite specialised, beyond the competence of typical fire risk assessors and fire and rescue service fire safety officers, and often incapable of an informed opinion, purely on the basis of a visual inspection. Intrusive inspection involving destructive exposure and sometimes testing of materials might be necessary. Again, this opinion is widely held within the fire safety profession and is supported by the FIA guidance, to which I've referred in the previous paragraph, and indeed in paragraph 3.16 you have referred to some guidance there, or at least to the FIA.
Yes, sir.
And I should also, to be fair to you, point out the fact that the basis of the view you express in 3.17 is also to be found in 3.15 about the general opinion about the external wall build-up falling outside the scope of the FSO, a point we've already covered.
We did, sir, yes.
To go back to. My first question is, was the assessment of the cladding on Grenfell Tower beyond Mr. Stokes's competence?
Yes, sir.
It was. Does that mean that the NOS 3 training that he received, which included training on external fire spread and cladding systems, was insufficient to equip him to offer an opinion on the fire safety of the cladding system?
I wouldn't have expected it to go into that level of detail, sir.
Right. So that's is that a no?
No,
It wasn't
sorry,
sufficient.
No, sorry.
No, it's all right. Now, if assessing the cladding was outside the scope of Mr. Stokes's competence as a fire risk assessor, can you help me what business Mr. Stokes had in expressing a view about its fire safety or its performance?
Yes, this is a very interesting question, sir, and a common philosophical chestnut. And I think I addressed this in the report itself. It's a very common conundrum that if someone in the fire sector is tasked with doing one job, and if I could simplify it, servicing fire extinguishers, and they spot a problem on the means of escape, should they blinker themselves and say, I'm not competent to advise on means of escape, knowing that there is something wrong with the means of escape? Should they say, I'm here to service the fire extinguishers, means of escape's not my problem? Now, the view of the sector, and this has come up even in prosecution cases, the view of the sector is you need to be very careful from a liability point of view, because if you start to talk about means of escape as a fire extinguisher technician, you've spotted one problem, and if there's another problem, you may end up with a civil liability because people will say, you were advising us on means of escape. Look, you pointed that out. Why did you not point this other point out? My view, sir, is the safety of the public should take precedence over people's concerns over their own liability. And even if they are not competent in an area and not being paid to comment on an aspect of fire safety, if they think there is a concern for the safety of the public, they ought to draw it to someone's attention. And if they want to protect their liability, they can do that with a caveat that I haven't looked at all of these things, I'm not competent in this area, but by the way, I think you should look at that.
Right. And would the competent fire risk assessor express any opinion on a matter outside their expertise and experience?
Yes, they would, but they'd probably caveat it.
I see.
It happens a lot, sir.
Yes, there may be some assistance on this in past 79, so help me with that. Can we go to past 79, please, at page 24?
Can you give us a reference to the transcript, please?
Yes, it's CST 703, CTA 703.
Thank you.
It's you can see the top of the page. The clause is competence of fire risk assessors, and if we can look at clause 7, paragraph Roman 2b.
Yes.
There's a bit of a run-up in the text. Competence does not necessarily depend on the possession of specific qualifications, etc. But if you look about 3/4 of the way down that block of text before the letters, it says, the following attributes of the fire risk assessor might be sufficient in conjunction with a study of suitable guidance documents. And then B says, an awareness of the limitations of the fire risk assessor's own experience and knowledge. And then C, a willingness and ability to supplement existing experience and knowledge where necessary by obtaining external help and advice. Now, in the light of that, would you expect Mr. Stokes to have told, well, sorry, let me ask you more slightly differently. What would you have expected Mr. Stokes to say about the cladding?
Okay. Just on B and C, again, it might help the inquiry to know that this is extracted directly from the ACOP under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. Just as background to those. So your question, sir, was what would I have expected Mr. Stokes to... Mr. Stokes' attention to the cladding, I think, was drawn by a sample that he saw, was it not, sir? He saw a sample that was there for the residents. He saw that it was fixed on timber.
Timber battens.
Timber battens, yes.
Yes.
And that was only a temporary arrangement, but it caused him some concern. And I think his recommendation was make sure that the cladding, and I think he even went on to say the method of fixing is satisfactory to building control. That's my best recollection, sir. And in that, he was straight down the middle following B and C.
Well, let's look at the text of what he did. Can we look at his April and June 2016 FRAs? We'll look at the April 2016 one, because that's probably the best place to go. CST 403161, please, page 4. And he says, at the very top of the page, new external cladding has been fitted to this building as part of the project of the refurbishment and construction work being undertaken on and within this building. The original external face of this building has been overclad. The new fire-rated cladding is fixed to the outface of the building by metal fixings, and the whole process has been overseen by the RBKC Building Control Department and officers. They have approved and accepted the fixing system and cladding used. Now, let me just give you a little bit of background about his evidence that he gave the inquiry. He told the inquiry that at the time he wrote that statement in this FRA, and indeed again in the June 2016 FRA a few months later, he had not seen any building control documentation, any independent information, and that it was based on an informal conversation with a representative from Ryden, Mr. David Hughes, and a conversation that he'd had with the TMO. Now, against that background, would you expect a competent fire risk assessor to make these statements in his FRA about cladding without having seen any underlying objective material to support them?
I think you can't take that paragraph out of the context of what I was referring to, sir, and that was a recommendation and an action plan of a previous fire risk assessment in which he expressed concern and recommended that there be consultation with building control. I don't know if you can find that at all.
Yes, we can. That would be the October 2014 FRA, which we can certainly show you if you want to see it.
I think it might be helpful
Yes,
in terms of contextualising for the chairman that paragraph.
Yes, you'll have to bear with me while we find the reference, Mr. Todd.
I apologise for...
Not at all. It's important that you give your evidence fully. Yes, can we go, please, to CST 403157, which is the October 2014 FRA, and if I will then find you the passage.
It would be in the action plan, sir, I think, if it helps.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you. CST 40s 3177. If we just look at that.
Yes, here we go.
And if we go to, I will find it for you.
Yes, that's not the one.
No, it's the last page of that. If we go to page 10, I think, is that what you were after?
Yes, here we go.
Yes, actions to be taken. Let me just show them to you. He says, I would recommend that the contractor provides, 1, the scope of works covering how this cladding, how will the cladding be fixed to the building, what fixings will be used, the fire rating of the cladding and the fixings, the building control officer's acceptance of this fixing system, and the cladding used.
Yes. And that was what I meant, sir, when I said that I regarded that as compliance with the B and C that you took me to, because Mr. Stokes, by his own admission, is not terribly knowledgeable about cladding. No surprise there, wouldn't expect him to be. So he has recognised the limitation of his own knowledge, B, and then on C, he's expressed a willingness to supplement his own knowledge by reference to others. So he basically refers people to building control because they would have or should have the expertise to deal with that.
Yes. Can we then come back, please, to the text? I mean, we can have both at the same time. Perhaps that's a good idea. That would be a good idea so that you can see both the context from 2014 and the April 2016 FRA. Can we go back, please, to CST 403161, page 4, keeping this on the screen? So have both up at once. Now, you've got, I think, everything you need there. Going back to the text on the right-hand side, in the second sentence where it says, the original external face of this building has been overclad, the new fire-rated cladding is fixed to the outface of the building by metal fixings, and the whole process has been overseen by the RBKC Building Control Department and officers. They've approved and accepted the fixing system and cladding used. There's no qualification or equivocation in that statement, is there?
No, that's correct, sir.
Would you expect a competent fire risk assessor to make that statement, unqualified and unequivocal, in his FRA about cladding without having seen any underlying documentary material to support them?
They had a completion. Did they have the completion certificate by then, sir? Sorry to answer the question with a question.
No. By neither time, but by the time of neither the April nor the June 2016 FRAs did Mr. Stokes see.
Right. So he's made the recommendation that, building control shouldn't have needed that recommendation. They should have been doing that anyway. But Mr. Stokes tries to flag up that this in particular needs to be considered by building control. Now, I don't know what assurances he had in that respect. I believe Ryden's told him that it had all been approved. There's a handwritten note of a meeting in which he says BC, I think it's something like B/C approval, obviously meaning building control. So people have told him that building control have agreed this. I don't think it's incumbent on him to say, well, show me a bit of paper that says that.
Well, let me explore this a bit more. Can we go to your main report at page 78?
Yes.
Because there we see that you say, at paragraph 825, in the second sentence, I'll read the whole thing to you because it gives you the full context. But you say, furthermore, the Building Control Department issued a completion certificate. Such a certificate constitutes evidence, though not conclusive evidence, of compliance with the building regulations. In view of the circumstances outlined above, including Mr. Stokes's expression of concern that the cladding be subject to approval by the Building Control Department, it was, in my opinion, reasonable for Mr. Stokes to assume that the cladding and its method of fixing complied with requirement B4 of Part B of Schedule 1 to the Building Regulations 2010 in relation to external wall construction.
Yes.
Now, that's what you say. My question is, wouldn't the competent fire risk assessor record exactly that, namely that what he says is his assumption only, which he had not verified and was not qualified to verify?
He could have said it was I assume that it has, but it was a reasonable assumption for him to make, such as to virtually treat it as an assertion, because why would it not? The whole project had been subject to building regulations approval, and if I could give some support to that view, sir, we've talked about the sleeping accommodation guide, sir, you will recall, albeit that it didn't help you with high-rise blocks of flats. But in all of the CLG guides on the fire safety order, the same wording appears, and I'm sure you have access to it. But in each of the CLG guides, the risk assessor is advised, the RP and the risk assessor is advised that if a building has been constructed or altered, and here we have an alteration, under building regulations. In other words, in circumstances that require approval under the building regulations, you will probably have nothing else to do. There's an encouragement to accept that building control have done their job properly.
My query with you is about the text of the statement.
Yes.
We clearly see that he didn't spell out that this was simply an assumption on his part.
No, he didn't.
No. And my question is, might the text, let's go back to it so we've got it on the screen. It's CST 403161, page 4, top of the page. Might not that statement lead the reader to think that Mr. Stokes himself had independently assessed the cladding for its fire safety and was making a statement about its adequacy?
I personally wouldn't, but I can see that a layperson might.
I mean, even if Mr. Stokes had said no more than that building control had approved and accepted the cladding system, would that constitute a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment for the cladding?
I think the fact that the project was carried out under building regulations, building control were responsible for ensuring compliance with Regulation B4. I think it's an absolutely reasonable assumption when you come to do the fire risk assessment that what is there is compliant with the building regulations. Otherwise, you're doing building control's job for them or acting as an independent auditor of building control.
Yeah. So would it follow from that Mr. Stokes didn't actually conduct any fire risk assessment on the cladding?
Well, I wouldn't have expected him to.
So why is it in his FRA then?
It's in his FRA, I imagine, because it's relevant that there has been this alteration, and it's relevant that the alteration was carried out under building regulations and required approval by building control.
I'm not sure I'm following this.
Okay.
The purpose of a fire risk assessment is, as a document, is a statement of findings by the fire risk assessor pursuant to his task acting as such. If you wouldn't have expected Mr. Stokes to carry out a fire risk assessment of the cladding, why is he making statements about the cladding in his fire risk assessment?
Because if he hadn't, sir, I'd be sitting here and you'd be asking why Mr. Stokes did not refer to the fact that cladding had been added to the building and that was a material alteration.
Was building control's opinion a fire risk assessment for the purposes of Article 9 of the FSO?
No, it's their role is compliance with the building regulations. And if they'd done their job properly, sir, as Mr. Stokes assumed, then there wouldn't have been a problem.
So nobody conducted a fire risk assessment of the cladding then?
You don't carry out a fire risk assessment of each little individual component of a structure, sir. The fire risk assessment is holistic in relation to the building. And there are components that you have to consider. Mr. Stokes quite correctly considered the cladding because it was a change to the building. It would have been incompetent of him not to refer to the fact there had been this change, and it was relevant for him to record that the process of the refurbishment had been carried out under the watchful eye, supposedly, of building control.
I'm very sorry. I'm not sure I'm following.
I'm sorry then, I didn't make it clear.
I'm not sure I'm following because you say in your answer that he correctly considered the cladding because it was a change to the building. But
yes.
He is a risk assessor. What is the point of him considering cladding as a change to the building within the scope of his risk assessment, unless it forms part of the fire risk assessment itself?
Well, can I help you with an analogy in that case, sir? There were new flats constructed. It was reasonable for him to assume that the structural elements would have adequate fire resistance. He wouldn't have had to carry out a fire risk assessment of the structural elements. He would have assumed that, reasonably assumed, that was all sorted out under building regulations.
Let me just put a paradigm to you. Was it not part of the reasonably competent fire risk assessor's task to say three things to the client? One, building control have not carried out a fire risk assessment for the purposes of the FSO. I am not competent to do so in respect of the cladding, and I have not done so. And therefore, thirdly, there's a material gap in the fire risk assessment for the refurbished building.
No, I'm sorry, I can't go along with that at all, sir.
So what should Mr. Stokes have done?
More or less what he did. He correctly, in narrative, pointed out, because any review of a fire risk assessment, I know this is a new fire risk assessment, but any review is required to refer to any alterations since the last fire risk assessment. So he knows cladding is an issue. He refers to the fact that there is cladding. He has correctly previously flagged up that someone needs to make sure with building control that it's okay because it's outside his competence. He's been told that this was checked with building control, and therefore it was a reasonable assumption for him to record that building control had approved it.
I understand that, but my point is really perhaps a narrower one. Wasn't it incumbent on Mr. Stokes simply to say that it's been passed by building control and he is assuming that that is all properly done, but makes no opinion of his own? He's not expressing an opinion of his own about the fire safety of the cladding, largely because he's not competent, experienced or expert enough to do so.
Well, there would be new emergency lighting provided in some areas of the building. He wasn't competent to examine you could say that for many components of fire safety that he has recorded is there and reasonably makes the assumption that it has been installed properly because someone else has looked at it. And the whole report could be caveated with, I assume that this person did their job properly. I assume that person did their job properly. It's a reasonable assumption and doesn't need to be stated as such, in my opinion, sir.
Given the risks of rapid vertical fire spread presented by a cladding system, and given the limitations on Mr. Stokes' ability to assess the cladding system itself,
yes,
in terms of its own fire risk, was it not nonetheless incumbent on Mr. Stokes, as a reasonably competent fire risk assessor, if that is what he was, to have noted in his fire risk assessment that the presence of cladding on this building was something which might affect the risk rating of the building overall, but which he was not competent to advise on, and its fire rating should be the subject of specialist advice?
No, I don't agree with that, sir.
Why don't you agree with that?
I don't agree with it because you're looking at one aspect of the building and the fire precautions, fire strategy for the building with the lens of hindsight. There would be a multiplicity of other things that you could say the same about. It just so happens that dreadfully this was one that was not dealt with properly by others. But you could say this about almost any aspect of a refurbished building that was approved under building regulations. Were the structural elements adequate?
I'm sorry, I was going to ask you just to deal with a slightly different aspect of this. At the time in question, so we're talking about 2016, I think.
Yes.
Was the danger that could be created by overcladding one that ought to have been apparent to a reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
Yes, sir, because we gave a warning about it in the LGA guide.
That's what I thought. So the presence of a potential danger
Yes.
in the cladding
Yes.
was something which at that time the competent fire risk assessor should have been aware of.
He was aware of it as a hazard without being able to assess it, assess the cladding. Yes, that's right, sir.
In that case, I'm not sure I quite understand why someone carrying out a fire risk assessment should not be expected to draw the client's attention to the presence of that hazard and advise the client to take expert advice to determine whether it existed or not.
Because all you'd be doing is repeating what building control should already have done. He tried to head off the problem at the pass rather than waiting till it was installed. Once it's installed, it's a bit late, because how would you assess it unless you cut a sample out, which would be somewhat absurd. So he tried to head off problems at the pass on this point by recognising that it was a hazard and saying, check with building control that they're happy. Then, on a second occasion, he asked Ryden, have you done that? And Ryden say yes, and he makes a little note of that handwritten. So twice, so first of all, he's told people to ask building control, but building control shouldn't have need told, sir. That was what they do for a living. But just in case, he actually flags it up and says, draw their attention to this. Then he asks, has their attention been drawn? Are they satisfied? At that stage, he's gone absolutely far enough, sir, in my opinion. And when he comes along and sees it installed, how would he carry out a risk assessment? To actually find out whether buildings have ACM, post-Grenfell, people had to get a contractor along, cut a bit out, and send it to BRE. You wouldn't, in a nicely completed building, say, by the way, just in case building control haven't done their job. You get the point, sir.
I understand the point, yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Todd, that is helpful. Mr. Millett, we've been running for about an hour and a quarter, and I think we ought to have a break.
I think it's a good idea, yes.
We're going to have a break at this point, Mr. Todd. We'll come back at 12:05. And as usual, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Hopefully I'm meeting your objective of shorter answers, sir.
You are. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. 12:05. Would you ask Mr. Todd to come back in, please? Yes, please, Mr. Todd, sit down. All right. We carry on?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr.
Yes, thank you,
You're
Mr.
ready.
Chairman. Mr. Todd, just to finish off on this line of questions about the external cladding system at Grenfell Tower and Mr. Stokes, can I ask you please to go to the LGA guide at HOM 000 page 111.
You're going to take me to the word assessment, possibly, sir?
Well, I'm going to show you the whole thing, I think.
Yeah.
72, external fire spread. We've seen it before.
Yes.
But we'll come back to it again. The external facades of blocks of flats should not provide potential for extensive fire spread. When assessing existing blocks of flats, particular attention should be given to any rain screen or other external cladding system that has been applied to and to facades that have been replaced. Just looking at that, what should Mr. Stokes have done when visiting Grenfell Tower in April 2016 and seeing the cladding?
More or less what he did, sir. I thought you might be interested in the use of the word assessing there.
Well, I was a roundabout way of me expressing that interest.
Yes, I thought you
in that
would.
way. What would you tell me?
So this is not in the section on fire risk assessment, and you'll probably notice, sir, in the section on fire risk assessment, we don't suggest that there be an assessment of external wall construction because there are very few people in the country actually competent to assess external walls. The new legislation that will require that has effectively created a new profession of external wall assessors. So you may ask, and it would be a very reasonable question to ask, why are we saying assessing here? And it's probably not the best word, if I'm absolutely honest. But bear in mind, this is a general indication to everybody, not just fire risk assessors, that be careful about external cladding systems.
Well, as I read it, and you're the expert, of course, and having had input into its drafting, you will know better. But as I read it, this is a warning to everybody, but particularly responsible persons,
yes,
and their fire risk assessors retained for the purpose.
Yes.
So, what is involved, or what was intended to be involved, in an assessment of an existing block of flats where there was a rain screen or other external cladding system present?
Yeah, I think it was really just a general blanket warning to everybody that rain screen cladding is a problem, potentially. And I don't think you've ever taken me to it, but you will find an even closer warning, if you like, a more specific warning in the bit on unauthorised alterations, where we specifically say that one potential effective alterations would be a landlord fitting rain screen cladding retrospectively to a building. So this is, bear in mind this as I've explained before, sir, this is a general guide to fire safety in blocks of flats, not to fire risk assessment specifically. And that is why you don't see this in section D, but you do see it as just a general warning to everybody about cladding systems, and particularly at the design stage, before you actually do it.
Well, it doesn't say that. It says
No, it says has been applied.
Has been applied.
I know. Yes, I realise that, sir.
Yeah. So it's not. Just answering the question on the text, what is it that a responsible person or a fire risk assessor retained for the purpose should do when assessing an existing block of flats and giving particular attention to the rain screen? They turn up. What do they do?
There's not a lot they can do, sir.
So what's the point of paragraph 72.1 here?
Just a general, as I said, a general warning. If you remember, we inserted this because of concern over the whole subject of rain screen cladding
The wording might not be perfect. I think it was a fairly late change. It's not. If I can tell you what it isn't, it's not an instruction to the fire risk assessor or a suggestion that the fire risk assessor should carry out some particular assessment of cladding that's in place. They may take note of it. If there was something that worried them, they could raise it. But if there was nothing to flag up that there would be an issue, we wouldn't expect, with the greatest respect, the risk assessor to do anything. And if it was recently installed, supposedly, under the watchful eye of building regulations, we certainly wouldn't expect them to question that.
Right. Would Mr. Stokes, or should Mr. Stokes, in the light of Section 72 of the LGA Guide in particular, have advised the TMO that, notwithstanding the fact that the rain screen system at Grenfell had been passed by building control, nonetheless, a fire risk assessment of the building needs to be carried out in the light of that alteration, but that he wasn't competent to do it because he was not competent to assess the fire safety of the cladding, and a specialist was needed?
No, I wouldn't
not?
go along with that at all, sir.
Why is that?
Because that's just not what was done.
Well, it wasn't, but my question really is, should it not have been done?
Why would... Sorry, I shouldn't answer a question with a question. It wouldn't have been appropriate to take a project that has just been completed under building regulations, and pay a rarefied specialist, and it would be a rarefied specialist. It would be one of quite a small number of people in the country to come along and drill holes in it and stick a borescope to see if the cavity barriers were in place, for example, or to cut a piece out, as I said before the break, sir, and send it off for analysis. This was a recently completed project, supposedly under building regulations. There would be nothing that I would consider puts up a red flag to a fire risk assessor that would cause him to say, now get some specialists to come and look at it.
Now, can we then move on to another document? You'll recall that we saw the 6th of April 2017 letter from Assistant Commissioner Daly,
Yes, sir.
Laura Johnson,
Yes.
the Tall Buildings External Facades letter.
Yes.
We can see from the documentary trail that on the 19th of April 2017, Mr. Stokes was sent that letter.
Yes.
And asked by Janice Ray a few days later to confirm that the TMO did not have any external cladding blocks of the nature described in the letter. And let's look at his response to that. This is at CST 403112. If we go to the foot of the page, we can see Janice Ray's email to Carl Stokes on the 24th of April 2017. Carl, my understanding is that we do not have any blocks with external cladding of this nature. Are you able to confirm, please? And then Mr. Stokes's response the same day, a few hours later, was... Grenfell was clad, but the cladding complied with the requirements of the building regulations. Lots of questions asked of Rydens and answers received back from them.
Yes, I think that was the point I made before the break, sir.
Well, my question is, just explain to me the point made before the break, which is supported by this document.
That Mr. Stokes, having, just to go through the steps again, building control shouldn't have needed to be told. Mr. Stokes drew particular attention to the matter because he was aware of it, and I believe that he was aware of it because of the LGA guide. I can tell you why I think that, if it's relevant. And he's not satisfied with that, but he's asked questions of the contractor, and he's got answers back. And that's what I said before the break, and that really reinforces what I said before the break, that he had asked the questions and got answers.
Yes, he'd asked the questions, he'd got answers, but hadn't himself carried out a fire risk assessment using his expertise and experience in relation to the cladding, had he?
he didn't have any expertise that would allow him to carry out a specific assessment in relation to the cladding. And as I tried to explain, sir, there weren't that many people in the country who, in the fire sector, who would have that expertise.
Mr. Stokes, tell me, do you agree that Mr. Stokes did not himself know whether the cladding complied with the requirements of the building regulations? All he knew is that he'd been told by somebody that building regulations had passed it.
That's correct, sir.
And therefore, when he says cladding complied with the with the requirements of the building regulations, that was an unverified statement by him, wasn't it?
Well, it was verified by Rydens to him.
Yes, but he'd not done any. He hadn't done, and I don't think was qualified to do any compliance check himself. It's just second-hand hearsay, isn't it, or third-hand hearsay?
I think that downgrades it somewhat below its proper status. He hadn't checked that the elements of structure that held the building up, or any new parts of the building, were fire resisting, and he would reasonably assume that that had been dealt with under building regulations. There's lots of things that he would have reasonably assumed were dealt with by building regulations, which goes back to something I explained to the chairman, I think, on day one. The two branches of fire safety, if you like, building regulations and ongoing legislation. And there has always been an assumption promoted by government itself, as I explained before the break, that building regulations would have been adequately applied by a building control body. And otherwise, what's the point of them doing their work if someone else has to come along and independently verify it?
Well, my question is a much narrower one.
I see.
Than that. It's almost textual. He says here, unqualified, the cladding complied with the requirements of the building regulations. My question is, would a reasonably competent fire risk assessor make that statement without having verified himself whether they complied or not? Or would the reasonably competent fire risk assessor say, I am told by building regulations, by building control, or Ryden, that the cladding has complied?
I think that's a very pedantic point. I think that statement is perfectly reasonable in the circumstances, and I think a competent risk assessor would quite commonly express it in those terms, sir. It'll be for the chairman to decide, of course, whether that's wrong, but all I can tell you is I see nothing wrong with that sentence.
You don't?
Not in the circumstances.
Even though Mr. Stokes hadn't himself carried out any compliance check?
Compliance check, how, sir?
I think we've got the point, Mr. Millett.
Yeah. Fire risk management, next topic. Can we go to SAL 56013, please? Now, this is Salvus's fire safety management report undertaken for the TMO, dated the 22nd of September 2009, sent to Carl Stokes on the 28th of September 2010, just after he'd won the tender for the medium risk programme for the TMO. And if we look at this report, in total, well, first of all, I'm assuming you've read this before.
I do believe I have. I don't remember much about this particular document,
Right.
sir.
If we look at it, we can see that it identifies some 19 breaches of statute, what it calls statutory breaches, in relation to TMO's fire safety management.
So it claims, sir. I believe that. Yes.
Yes, on its face. Now, would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have satisfied himself when he came into the job a year later that those deficiencies had been remedied?
Could you remind me what the breaches were, sir?
Yes, absolutely. If we go to the middle of this document, page 5, this is where the list starts. And the first one under 1.1 on that page is lack of a TMO fire safety policy statement.
Yes, that's good practice. I'm not sure why that's a statutory breach of exactly.
Well, I'm just showing you that by way of reminding you what the
Yes.
breaches were. That's the
Yes.
first one. There are 19 or so. And
Yes.
Scroll down. Let's just scroll into it a little bit further. 1.2, lack or inadequate TMO policy and arrangements. 1.3, lack of inadequate recording systems, for example, logbook and or fire safety manual.
Yep. Pausing there, sir. It's a positive, a clear and positive. There is a clear and positive lack of any statutory requirement to keep records of testing and maintenance. That's very well established.
And then over the top onto page 6, 1.4, lack of ineffective managerial audit of fire safety arrangements. And it continues in that vein under different topics. You can see topic 2, fire safety organisation, roles and responsibilities. 3, training and competence. Over the page, onto page 7, active monitoring, fire safety inspections of premises and facilities, etc. And it runs to 19 in total. My question is, would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have satisfied himself that those deficiencies had been remedied, at least when he became formally appointed to the TMO to carry out FRAs on medium risk properties in October 2010?
I wouldn't have expected him to use that as a checklist because a lot of it is very vague. A lot of it is not actually a statutory breach. It's good practice. And I would have expected Mr. Stokes to, as it were, start with a clean sheet of paper and determine for himself whether the management standards were adequate. I would expect him to do that. I'm not sure that this document was terribly helpful in the first place.
Why not?
Because there's some of this is about health and safety. The health and safety advisor appears to have sufficient competence to undertake the role in relation to health and safety, which includes elements of fire safety management. It was not possible at the time of the assessment to establish if all relevant staff have the necessary competence to implement the respective roles. A lot of it is so vague, sir, and some of it, as I said, is not a statutory breach anyway, that I would expect Mr. Stokes to use his own knowledge and skill to make up his own mind with a clean sheet of paper rather than using this particular document.
If we go to page 13 in this document.
Yes.
This is the action plan.
Yes.
And 1.1, I've shown you 1.1 before, and we have the action plan in relation to it. The deficiency was the absence of a TMO fire safety policy statement, as we've seen. And here we see Salvus's recommendation, a strong recommendation that one be developed, which set out the organisation's strategic fire safety objectives, including compliance with the fire safety order. You can see that.
Yes.
And in the second row, it's strong advice. It is strongly advised that adequate policy and supporting arrangements are introduced to explain how the TMO will meet the objectives set out in the strategic policy statement so as to ensure suitable and sufficient fire safety is maintained at all times throughout the managed estate property portfolio. I've shown you both of those. Would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have sought and reviewed a copy of the TMO fire safety policy to the extent that there was one before carrying out any fire risk assessments for the TMO?
If you wanted to have a full understanding of fire safety management, I think that would be helpful. It probably wasn't terribly helpful in carrying out a hands-on practical fire risk assessment for a building.
Do you mean by that answer that on a building-by-building basis it was no help?
It would be of minor help, sir, but probably not hugely if you were to take it building by building.
Can we go to your main report?
Yes.
Page 73, paragraph 7.41.
Yes. Yes.
And you say there, we've seen this before, with regard to management of fire safety, matters to be considered include, and the first item on your list of matters to be considered in respect of management of fire safety
Yes.
is
The fire
the
safety
fire
policy.
safety policy of the organisation.
Yes.
Do you agree that Mr. Stokes should have considered it?
Yes, in terms of the practical aspects that affected the individual buildings. So, for example, to talk Turkey, if I can use that term, he'd need to know what the policies were on testing, maintenance, monitoring, and so on. But very often a policy starts with, in this case, the TMO are committed to the principles of fire safety and ensuring that everyone who enters their buildings are safe from fire. Wonderful high-level statement. It's not going to help them with his fire risk assessment. So there are definite elements of a policy that he would need to understand before he could do the fire risk assessment. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I mean, leave aside the self-serving stuff at the start.
Yes.
Which everyone puts in there.
They do.
You would expect to see, in a properly crafted fire safety policy, some nuts and bolts, wouldn't you?
You would.
Yes, and those nuts and bolts would be important for Mr. Stokes to know before he carried out his first fire risk assessment.
Yes, because he'd need to know what they were doing in terms of
Exactly.
testing and maintenance.
Yes, thank you. Now, can we go, please, to CST 401822, which is a letter Mr. Stokes wrote to Janice Ray on the 23rd of June 2010. And the subject is employee fire training, personal emergency evacuation plans, PEEPs, and the lift maintenance, servicing and testing policy in TMO-controlled buildings. Now, this followed a meeting, I should just tell you, that they'd had the previous day, as you can see from the first line.
Yes, sir.
In relation to employee fire safety training, PEEPs, and lift maintenance policies in TMO buildings. And if you look at the second paragraph, Mr. Stokes says this: when completing any fire risk assessments for buildings under the control of the Tenants Management Organisation, TMO, for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in future, and where TMO employees are present in the buildings, the information in this letter will be used as a basis for the fire training and fire warden section of the document. So it's clear that this information would be used in future fire risk assessments. Chasing the history a little bit further forward, I'll just show you a little bit of evidence. CST 403061, we come to a letter dated the 27th of September 2010, which followed a meeting which Mr. Stokes had with Miss Ray on the 24th of September 2010, the day after he'd been awarded the medium risk programme. And you can see here in the letter, in the first paragraph, he says, after meeting on Friday the 24th of September 2010, etc., I would like to put in writing the management procedures, topics and issues, etc. we discussed, so that when completing any fire risk assessments for residential buildings under the control of the TMO, in future, these standards and observations will apply. And then the letter goes on to cover a number of matters, and you can see them listed there below.
Yes.
Above the heading Employee Fire Training towards the bottom of your screen. There are a number of them. One of them includes PEEPs, as you'll see, and we'll come back to that perhaps later. But my first question arising from these two letters I've just shown you is, would you have expected Mr. Stokes to carry out an assessment of the TMO's overall fire risk management system at the outset of his contract?
I think this is what he's trying to do by taking components of their management system, and he's obviously been asking questions about it, sir.
Yes. And do you, having asked that, or answered that question, the next question is, do you consider that what Mr. Stokes set out in these two letters was an adequate assessment or adequate questions designed to form part of an assessment of the TMO's overall fire safety management arrangements?
As the topic, sir, do you mean?
Well, as an assessment.
He's covered training. He's covered a very important thing, which is information to residents, in-house inspections, evacuation strategy. He mentions PEEPs, lift, fixed installations, signage, contractors. If I sat and thought about it, I might be able to add to it, but it's certainly a good starter for 10.
Well, would not a better start of a 10 have been to have picked up the Salvus report from the previous year and use that as a basis, not the only basis necessarily, but a basis for understanding his client's fire safety management systems?
Yes, my view of the Salvus report, which I think I've implied, was that it was all very high-level, grandiose stuff. This stuff is hands-on things that are a translation of policy that Mr. Stokes, as a man on the ground, as it were, needed to know.
Well, you say it's high-level, grandiose stuff. I wonder if that's really fair, Mr. Todd. Can we go back to SAL
Certainly.
6013, page 5? The absence of a TMO fire safety policy statement.
Yes, we talked about that.
Yes. Now, I mean, you're not in a position to say whether that's factually correct or not.
No.
No. But on the basis that it's factually correct that there wasn't one, why is that a high-level and grandiose problem? It's maybe a high-level problem because it's a serious problem, fundamental problem, isn't it? It's not grandiose, is it?
The fire policy doesn't always help you in carrying out a practical fire risk assessment for the reasons I discussed. He's taken bits out of what would be a fire policy and translated them into something practical that he needs to know.
And take another one, 1.4 at the top of page 6, lack of effective managerial audit of fire safety arrangements. And then it says the health and safety advisor appointed by TMO appears to have sufficient competence, which includes elements of safety, not possible at the time of the assessment to establish if all relevant staff have the necessary competence to implement their respective roles in regard to fire safety. Why is that grandiose and high level?
Well,
it's quite granular.
I don't think it is granular, sir. I'm not sure what they're actually looking for in terms of something practical that Mr. Stokes could have looked at.
Well, let me give you a better example then. 4.1 on page 7, lack of an adequate general inspection and monitoring of premises and facilities. And in the italics, the complaint is that there's no current formal checks on fire doors or fire exits, storage, security matters. Guidance provided doesn't appear to indicate fully the procedure to follow in the event of finding deficiencies, to whom completed reports should be sent for audit purposes. A site plan and fire safety drawing is not currently available, showing relevant fire safety arrangements for any TMO managed properties to assist local wardens, etc., with fire safety checks. Not possible at the time of the management assessment to confirm how defects to safety critical issues are managed and if all repairs are up to date. Why was that not a very helpful set of initial signposts to Mr. Stokes when embarking on an understanding of his client's fire safety management system?
Well, he has picked out some of these because he's picked out inspections and so on. But when you do a fire risk assessment, sir, one of the things that you don't include is how repairs are managed. It's almost a different exercise. This is almost related. You remember, sir, you took me to PAS 7, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Which is now a BS. And that's a different standard from the standard for fire risk assessment. That's the standard for how fire safety is managed in an organisation, particularly at high level. That's a different exercise, really. A fire risk assessor does not sit down and say, how are you managing repairs within the organisation? What's your structure for managing repairs? That's not part of a fire risk assessment, nor would you find that sort of matter covered in PAS 79, sir.
Well, you say that. Can we go to Annex E, CTA 703, page 106? This is a model pro forma.
Sorry, I haven't got anything yet on the screen, sir.
No, I'm going to tell you you're right. There it is. It's informative. So
yes.
We know that. But this is a model pro forma for documentation of a review of an existing fire risk assessment for premises in England and Wales. And if we go to page 111, there's a section on management of fire safety, isn't there?
There is.
And the first of which is 13.1. There's a box to record significant changes in management of fire safety since the time of the risk assessment. Now, do you accept that would appear to suggest that up-to-date information on fire safety management matters should be obtained when carrying out any fire risk assessment review?
Yes, you'd look for any changes. This is looking for changes.
It's looking for changes, but in relation to fire safety management?
Yes.
Yes. And if we look at 14.1,
Yes.
there's a more general question. Are arrangements for management of fire safety adequate? Tick box, yes or no.
Yes.
And then a text box underneath it to note any comments and deficiencies observed. What assessment is envisaged will be carried out by the fire risk assessor in response to that question?
Now, to help you with that, sir, could you possibly go to the section of PAS 79 on fire safety management, and I can help you walk through that to answer your question.
Yes, if I can find it just off the top of my head, help me with this. I think it may be page 50.
I don't remember page number.
We'll find out.
But you'll find it's, there we go. Well done.
Thank you.
And so there we find who is responsible for fire safety in the premises. Now, within the template for the fire risk assessment, it's actually pointed out that is not, this designation of responsibility isn't part of the fire safety order, but it's a good idea, and we make that clear. Access to suitable advice on the requirements of fire safety legislation. That is what I called the competent assistant. So this is looking at Article 18. Procedures to follow. That's looking at Article 15. Nomination of people to respond to fire and, where appropriate, to assist with evacuation. Article 15. Arrangements for liaison with the fire and rescue service. Good practice, not defined within the fire safety order, but part of fire safety management.
Yeah, can we stop and can we just look at it together?
Sorry, I should have let you drive it.
Well, it's all right. It'd be nice if it was a joint venture. So the general here, in the fire risk assessment, fire safety management needs to be regarded as of equal importance to fire protection measures. Pausing there, do you agree or disagree?
100%.
Yes. In its broadest sense, fire safety management includes certain policies and procedures designed to prevent the occurrence of fire by eliminating or controlling fire hazards. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. However, most of these aspects of fire safety management have already been considered in Clause 13, which we can go to if you like, but it'd be nice if we didn't have to.
I don't think
Then it says fire safety management also includes the following, and then there's this long list, you see.
Yes, I do.
Designated responsibility for fire safety in the premises, et cetera, and it includes procedures for people to follow in the event of fire, including people with special responsibilities, nomination of people to respond to fire, et cetera, documentation, implementation of the action plan. It goes on at length. If you look at subparagraph 3, it says points A to K are discussed in the sections of the commentary that follow. Point L is discussed in clause 19 and M in 20. It's important that matters in the paragraphs that follow are properly considered in the fire risk assessment and that the fire safety management is taken into account in the subjective judgment of overall fire risk. Is it not correct, therefore, that a reasonably competent fire risk assessor would be expected to consider all the fire safety management factors covered in clauses 13, 16, 19 and 20 of PAS 79?
Correct, sir, which was my point, that a number of the things that you were taking me to in the Salvis management of fire safety review is are not the management issues considered in a fire risk assessment. It's a different exercise. So you took me to the review document about management of fire safety. That's looking for any changes in anything in what you described, sir, as a big long list.
But have you actually done an exercise of comparing the contents of clause 13, 16, 19 and 20 of PAS 79 on the one hand with the contents of these and recommendations in the Salvis report on the other?
No, I read the Salvis report, sir, and I took it that was almost a different exercise that they were carrying out rather than something directly associated with a fire risk assessment.
Well, if you look at some of the factors listed in... Well, before I ask that question, just on that, following up on your last question, you said it was a different exercise.
Yes.
Assuming that it was an exercise which was different, would it not nonetheless be an important result of the exercise for a fire risk assessor to know, before embarking on his task, which does include the matters that I'm showing you on the screen.
Well, it was more a PAS 7 a PAS 7 assessment. It was more akin, as I saw it, sir, to a PAS 7 assessment. And some of that would be outside the scope of the fire risk assessor's work. Some of it would be inside the scope.
Yeah.
That which is inside the scope, we would find in this clause here, which lists the sort of practical hands-on things that the fire risk assessor would need to concern them with because they emanate from the fire safety order.
And this comes back to a broader question, which I wanted to come back to, which I'd asked you, having shown you box 13 and 14 in Annex E. Does not the presence of the questions in that box and the material at clause 16 on page 50 that we've seen suggest that the fire risk assessor does have to concern himself with management of fire safety, or at least many aspects of management?
Absolutely, sir.
Yes.
And it's very often far more important than, if I can express it this way, whether there's 3 hinges on a fire door or 2 hinges. Management of fire safety is actually one of the most important things to look at.
Yes, yes. And Mr. Stokes didn't include these sections, in other words, sections 13 and 14 in Annex E, and we can go back to those, in any of his fire risk assessments for Grenfell Tower after his first one he did for Salvus in 2009. As a matter of record, would you have expected him to have included them?
Sorry, could you show me what he hadn't included again, please, sir?
Yes, Annex E, page 106 of this document.
Yes, that
Annex E.
yes, that's a review if you're not going to carry out a complete new fire risk assessment. This is a sort of short form, abbreviated assessment if you are not going through the whole thing again. But Mr. Stokes wasn't actually carrying out that short form review. He was carrying out a new fire risk assessment. That's very different from a review.
If there was no review, or if there was no properly documented review, let alone a review done under the informative Annex E, so that there was no document which would tell Mr. Stokes when he came to do his FRAs in the years he did what fire safety management what there was or what changes there had been, would you expect Mr. Stokes at least to ask the question when he came to do his FRA?
I would expect him, I'd expect him to ask, this was the situation before, I take it that's still the same, have you got any changes? Yes.
And would you expect him to include in his risk assessments, or fire risk assessments, at least something about the status or situation of fire safety management at the TMO, even if only by way of changes that he'd been told about?
I think he was picking through all that what you called the big list. I think he was more or less picking through that in the risk assessment.
And if in fact, as a fact, if Mr. Stokes did not assess significant changes in fire safety management in his subsequent fire risk assessments of Grenfell Tower, would you consider that that fell below acceptable standards?
If there were changes in the matters to which we've just looked at in clause 16 of PAS 79, yes.
Now, let's go back to page 50 of this document, PAS 79, please, and let's look at clause 16 again.
Yes.
And if we look at Roman 2, we can see the list, and in the list we can see F, arrangements for routine inspections of the premises and its fire precautions, or for more formal fire audits.
Yes.
Now, let me just give you some evidence. Mr. Stokes repeatedly raised questions in all of his fire risk assessment action plans, for Grenfell Tower at least, and indeed other buildings, about whether the caretakers or estate service assistants, ESAs, were carrying out their routine inspections and whether there were records kept.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, but he stated in the body of all of his fire risk assessments, at least for Grenfell Tower from 2010, that they were being carried out with records kept. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yes, I don't need to show you some examples. Would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have obtained, where possible, records showing that routine inspections of the premises were being carried out before his fire risk assessment, rather than raising it as an action?
Do you mean in advance of his fire risk assessment?
Well, as part of the exercise of conducting it,
Of
before
conducting
writing
it.
his report and submitting it to his client.
He would. You tend to sample records. I think, as I explained before, it's not an ISO 9000 audit where if there's no record of something, to all intents and purposes, it hasn't been done. So the level to which a fire risk assessor would examine documentation, such as records, would depend on a number of things. Their pre-knowledge of the practices that were carried out, the trust they had in the client, what they were being told on this particular occasion. And so it's more an art than a science to determine what records you'd wish to look at.
Yes, in practicing the art, would you expect Mr. Stokes to have asked to see records and discovered whether or not there were any?
Records of some things, sir, certainly. Sample records of things, but it would be, the art comes in which records they want to see.
Right.
To put it this way, sir, in simple terms, and this will be a nutshell, if you think the client's a complete rogue and he's telling you he tests the emergency lighting, but you think, I don't believe that for 1 minute, then you would say, show me. In fact, you would not only say, show me the records, but you say, show me how you do it, because if they don't do it, they won't know.
Would it follow from
so
that?
on.
I'm sorry.
Well, just at the other extreme, if it's a client that is of high integrity that you've worked with for 5 years, and you know, for example, that the emergency lighting is always tested every month, and you've seen evidence of that before, and you'd be content to accept their word that we still test the emergency lighting every month.
Yes. Would it follow from what you just told us that where a fire risk assessor hasn't managed to obtain records of routine inspections, and it wasn't known to him whether routine inspections were in fact being carried out, would you expect the fire risk assessor to have made comment in their fire risk assessments?
Yes, it's a good practice point. It's not. It'll be difficult to point to an article of the fire safety order, but yes, you would expect him to be satisfied in his mind, however he became satisfied by it, whether verbal information, records or whatever, that someone was carrying out routine inspections. Yes, sir, that's right.
Yes. And would you expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor to factor the absence of records into his assessment of risk?
Not the absence of records. The absence of records doesn't establish that things aren't being done. The record keeping is really protects people's liability rather than reduces risk to anybody. Doing the inspections impacts on risk. Failing to write down that you've done it doesn't make a whit of difference.
No, you're right. Let me put the question slightly differently. If, in fact, Mr. Stokes had no means of knowledge about whether or not inspections were being carried out routinely or not, he had no way of knowing, and the records didn't tell him, such as they were, then would he not factor that into his risk assessment?
He would probably make a recommendation in that case that there should be routine inspections if nobody could even tell him that it was being done.
Yes. Now, can we go to clause L, or subclause L in this document, which you can see just above the foot of the screen, implementation of the action plan's recommendations. If Mr. Stokes was aware, in relation to Grenfell Tower, that the TMO had problems completing his action plan recommendations on time, and there was a persistent problem with tackling backlogs of actions, would you have expected him to refer to that problem in his risk assessments?
Yes, we kind of discussed this before, didn't we? That the symptom of what you've described would be he would keep finding the same thing time and time again, yeah. And therefore he'd want to, I think I called it earlier, make a fuss about it, sir.
Yeah, exactly. And would he have factored that time and time again re-emergence of the same problem into his assessment of the risk of the building?
I think we discussed that before as well. The risk would be what the risk was. The risk would have continued. It wouldn't have increased, but its continued presence would be a reflection on management that he would want to draw to attention.
Yeah, that's really my next question, that repeated problem was a fire safety management problem.
Yes, it is.
And as such, would that not factor into his risk assessment, not necessarily just for Grenfell Tower, but for other buildings in the TMO stock?
He would assess the risk as he found it. The lack of management might be the foundation for what he finds. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, well, it leads to another one. In view of the backlog question or issue problem, would you have expected Mr. Stokes to have offered general advice to the TMO on the fire risk consequences of not completing actions timorously in a systemic way?
I think that might be what I colloquially described as making a fuss.
Right, very, very good then, I understand. Now, I want to ask you a few questions about the risk rating matrix.
Oh, yes.
For each of his FRAs for Grenfell Tower, Carl Stokes undertook an assessment of the likelihood of the fire, or of fire, and assessed it at medium, and the consequence of fires presenting a risk of slight harm and the overall risk as tolerable.
Yes.
He did. Is it your opinion that the risk level of tolerable for each and every FRA of Grenfell Tower was a reasonable conclusion for Mr. Stokes to draw?
I think from all the things that you have put in front of me thus far, sir, there's probably only one thing that I would suggest increased the risk to moderate, and that would be if he were aware that the smoke control system was not working, then the protection of the staircase would be undermined, and that would, I would personally then increase the consequences accordingly, and then the risk would increase accordingly.
Yes, thank you. Now, can we go to your main report at page 99?
Yes, sir.
Paragraph 9.14. You say there, step 4 in the past 79 steps, past 79 steps,
yes,
involves determining the physical fire protection measures that contribute to safety in the event of fire, relevant to the protection of people in the event of fire. In my opinion, Mr. Stokes gave due consideration to all relevant fire protection measures to the extent appropriate in a suitable and sufficient FRA.
yes.
In the light of the answer that you've just helpfully given us about the risk level, does that still remain your opinion?
Yes, I think the only thing that would change my opinion was the information you gave me, sir, that the smoke control system was inoperative for a period of time. His scope was fine because he covered all the issues. But if it is in fact the case that he knew the smoke control system was not operative and didn't, as we talked about, provide a narrative on that, then that was an omission.
Is your answer still the same when we consider two other things? First of all, his incorrect statement that the lifts were firefighting / evacuation lifts and can be used by disabled persons in the event of emergency.
Yeah, that was a definite mistake.
Yes.
And we talked about that. And we talked about the implications. I don't consider that it would have affected the risk rating.
And what about the absence of any evidence that Mr. Stokes systematically assessed the internal features of the flat entrance doors at Grenfell Tower and thus did not evaluate the hazard posed by non-functioning or non-existent self-closing devices?
If it is correct, sir, that he didn't inspect the flat entrance doors correctly, then it's not so much that it impacted on the risk, it's more that he wasn't in a position to advise properly on what the risk is. If that is the case, and that's a matter of fact that he didn't examine the doors properly, then that it's not so much that enhances the risk, it means that his judgment of the risk is invalid. Can I put it that way?
Yes, I understand. Is it your view that it was reasonable for Mr. Stokes to assess the risk at Grenfell Tower as tolerable, even given the number of high priority red FRA actions recorded on each occasion?
Yes, tolerable doesn't mean that you can just walk away and accept it. It's all down to the definition of tolerable risk, which is that there's no big showstoppers that will need major capital expenditure, but you may have to do lots of little things that will, and there were lots of little things.
I see. And would that still be the case despite the absence of any record within each of the fire risk assessments of what steps have been taken since the last fire risk assessment to cure the actions outstanding in those?
We come back to the fact that the risk was what the risk was.
Now, can we go to PAS 79, clause 19.2, page 60?
Yes, sir.
We've looked at this, I think, yesterday. I just want to cover it off if I can. It says there, under recommendations, 19.2, the action plan should be such as to ensure that if implemented, it will reduce fire risk to or maintain fire risk at a tolerable level.
That's correct, sir.
And I think that principle is reflected, isn't it, in the template?
It is, sir.
Yes. But for our purposes, page 98 of this document.
Yes.
Where it says under the heading action plan, and it says what it says. So is it that the fire risk assessor must make an assessment of whether the actions once implemented will reduce or maintain the risk level to trivial or tolerable?
Yes, you've got it. You test it in your mind.
Right.
You imagine, now that's been done, what's my view now?
So when you're writing tolerable, do you assume the cure that you're of the items you're identifying, or do you assess it as it is?
Oh, no, as it is.
Right. So it's tolerable without the cure, the cures.
Yes, and then if say it were at moderate, then you would test in your mind to ensure the adequacy of your action plan. You hypothesise that they've carried out all the measures you've recommended, and you then hypothetically reassess the risk.
I understand. Now, in the light of that, let's examine what Mr. Stokes said about this, because we know he didn't include this section in his fire risk assessments. If we go to the transcript, please, for day 137, page 49. Mr. Chairman, I'm just looking at the clock while this comes up. If I can cover this before the short adjournment, I mean, I can. So,
yes, very well.
If that's acceptable to you, that would be good. At page 49, if you look at line 24, I'd shown him the template at PAS 79, which I just referred to you at page 98. And at line 24, I asked him this: can you explain why you didn't include that in your action plans? And over the page at page 50, answer: because it's already at tolerable. But in terms of the template, it's guidance only and was already at tolerable. You had already classified the risk to Grenfell Tower as tolerable, but was that the risk rating before or after the actions you recommended should be implemented? Answer: both. When you tick the tolerable box, yes. Was it tolerable if and on the assumption that the items you identified, the action items, are completed, or is it tolerable even though they're not completed? In other words, tolerable as the building stood. Answer at line 15: when the actions are completed, they would be tolerable. Question: this is why I asked the question. PAS 79 suggests that the tolerable box is ticked so as to maintain or reduce the level to what is ticked. So is the answer that it is only once, as I think you say, the actions are completed, that the risk is tolerable? Answer: in the particular case here, before they were tolerable, the actions would still make the building tolerable when it's completed as well. Now, is the approach described by Mr. Stokes in that exchange I've just read to you correct?
Well, he's kind of contradicted himself and then gone back to his first position. So at line 7, he says it was tolerable before and it was tolerable after. And then at line 15, he says when the actions are completed, they would be tolerable. That was in response to your question as to which it was. But then he goes back in line 21 to it was tolerable before and it'd be tolerable after. So I'm not quite sure what your question is, sir.
Well, my question is perhaps simple, but perhaps simplistic. But my question was, is the approach that he's describing there correct?
If he thought it was tolerable before and it was tolerable after, then he would in the risk assessment record that it's tolerable now, and in the action plan he would record, if he follows past 79, that it would be tolerable after the work was completed. So that would be his both. But then in the middle of that exchange, sir, he seemed to veer from that.
I see.
So I'm not quite sure what his approach was.
It seemed to me that begged a rather different question, which is, if it's tolerable before any suggestions are carried out, why do you need to make any suggestions?
Why?
But you can always improve things in some respect.
Yes. It's a formality included within PAS 79. It achieves nothing to say tolerable before, tolerable after. And I think that's your point, sir. If it's tolerable before and you make it better, it's bound to be tolerable, because it's never going to be trivial. It was a formality within the template.
I mean, would you expect a competent fire risk assessor to calculate the risk to premises at the same level, both at the time that the FRA is carried out and again in the mind once the necessary action has been taken to address the risk posed by the hazards identified?
If both are correct, yes.
Right. So is it quite common to say tolerable and would remain tolerable,
yes,
even though there are a myriad of red items?
Yes, you can sometimes have 30 items in an action plan, but none of them are showstoppers that are going to cause people to die. The tolerable, I'm not sure if this has come out, sir, from our exchange to help the chairman. The tolerable isn't, the risk assessor doesn't suddenly decide it's tolerable or moderate. He goes through the two components of risk, the probability of fire and the consequences of fire. And then the matrix drives him afterwards to determine, the matrix decides for him what the level of risk is. So the probability is always going to be medium in practice, because there's always things that can start a fire. So the key thing for you to look at, sir, is the consequences of fire. And that's perhaps more relevant, what he considered the consequences of fire to be, because it's from that he determined whether it's tolerable or risk or not.
Yes. Now, in the light of the evidence you've given and we've explored together, and in particular your opinion you've expressed about the AOV, which ought to have raised the risk rating to moderate, if the panel were to conclude on the basis of the evidence, including your opinion, that Mr. Stokes ought to have assessed the risk of Grenfell Tower at moderate and not tolerable, would his failure to identify the risk as moderate have fallen below acceptable standards?
On the basis of the smoke control system alone, yes, sir.
Yes.
If he knew that it wasn't working.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, it's time we stop for some lunch, Mr. Todd.
Thank you, sir.
So we're going to do that now. We'll come back at 2:05, please.
Thank you, sir.
The usual request, please don't speak to anyone about your evidence over the break.
Of course, sir. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to go with the usher, please.
Yes, of course.
I'm tempted to ask you, Mr. Millett, whether you'd regard progress as moderate or tolerable.
It depends which is better, but moderate.
Well, we just have to keep going.
Yes.
All right, 2:05 then, please.